The crisp hush of a first-class cabin shattered at exactly 2:47 p.m. on Flight 447 to Chicago. "Sir, you need to move to coach immediately." Lauren Tran's voice cut through the polished quiet like a scalpel. Phones flickered to life as passengers lifted their screens. Michael Lee, wearing only a white shirt, faded jeans, and a well-worn leather briefcase, remained perfectly still in seat 1A. His boarding pass and platinum status card glinted in the overhead lights. 6 years of loyalty, 340,000 miles, flown seat 1A, paid in full. Yet Lauren's next words dripped with assumption and bias. In that instant, what should have been an ordinary pre-flight gesture morphed into a searing act of racial profiling, and the world watched live. If you've ever witnessed injustice in real time, drop a comment below. Subscribe now and hit the bell to follow every thrilling beat of Michael's fight for dignity. The moment Lauren Tran delivered her demand, the cabin's atmosphere shifted. First-class passengers settling into flatbed seats and sipping champagne looked up from tablets and novels. The hum of the engines faded beneath the electric tension. For Michael Lee, however, it was déjà vu. He'd flown this route dozens of times, always greeted by polite smiles and smooth service. Today was different. Lauren's tablet hovered between them, its screen glowing with terminal data. She tapped at it again. "Your ticket confirms coach." She repeated her tone, leaving no room for debate. Michael met her gaze calmly. He held out his mobile boarding pass, seat 1A, issued 3 weeks prior, and then his platinum status card. The cabin lights danced off its metallic sheen. Around them, phones came alive. Twitter's @Skywatcher had already broadcast a live tweet, #Atlantic. Airways racial profiling at 30,000 feet. First-class passenger forced to coach despite platinum status. Within seconds, the hashtag trended among the passengers. First-class bias. Lauren swiped her tablet as though the data might magically change. At her back, Jessica Ortiz, another flight attendant, leaned in. "What's going on?" she whispered, curious. "He must be in the wrong seat," Lauren replied under her breath, as though placing Michael back in coach would erase the cameras lining the aisles. Michael's expression remained unshaken. He placed his briefcase at his feet and unfurled the boarding pass on the tray table. "Seat 1A. He said, voice measured. "Platinum status, 6 years running, 340,000 miles, paid 3 weeks ago." The click of cameras punctuated each word. At the front of the cabin, an elderly businessman in 2A scoffed. "Son, just move. No need to make a scene." His eyes, however, darted to the emerging commotion on his screen. Another passenger, a young woman in 3B, raised her phone. "This is discrimination," she murmured. Captain David Sinclair emerged from the cockpit door, his uniform immaculate silver stripes gleaming. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. "What's the holdup?" he asked, voice calm but undercut with authority. Lauren stepped aside to let Sinclair assess Michael. "He's in the wrong seat, Captain," she explained. Sinclair approached Michael and gestured to his documents. "May I see your boarding pass and ID?" Michael complied, passing over his phone displaying the pass and his government-issued ID. Sinclair examined them, then glanced at Lauren's tablet. The live stream on every phone now clocked over 5,000 viewers. "Ground security," Sinclair ordered. "Please." 2 officers appeared, veteran Tom Sanders and rookie Emma Cho, casting uneasy glances at the cabin full of recording devices. Sanders offered Michael a polite nod. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Michael leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I'm complying yet. I still hold seat 1A. Why am I being escorted off when I have valid documents?" Emma flipped through her tablet. "Our records indicate a coach booking, sir. You must have paid for an upgrade," Michael cut in. "If you believe that, check the timestamp." Boarding pass issued May 14th, 10:03 a.m., paid in full. He tapped the live stream's comment feed for emphasis. They see me." Flying trended as passengers seized the moment. In the cockpit, Sinclair sighed and raised his hand. "We can't delay departure much longer." Suddenly, Michael's phone pinged with an urgent notification. Board meeting moved to conference room A, 8:00 p.m. Urgent. He passed the message to Lauren. Her eyes flickered with recognition. Before Lauren could protest, Michael raised his hand to silence the cabin. He tapped his screen so every phone captured the alert. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice carrying over the hush. This isn't just about a seat. The airline's leadership is already convening a board meeting over this incident. A ripple of shock passed through the cabin. Even Sanders and Cho paused, realizing this was no ordinary removal request. Captain Sinclair's mask of control cracked. He stepped back, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Ground supervisor now, he muttered. Within moments, Natalie Reyes, ground supervisor 12 years with the airline, stormed in. Phone pressed to her ear, she scanned the cabin. Michael met her gaze. She checked her terminal, then raised a hand. Sir, you are confirmed in seat 1A. My apologies. Please remain seated. A collective gasp rose from the passengers. Cameras lowered, phones stopped trembling. In first class, Lauren's tablet clicked closed. Sanders and Cho relinquished their patrol positions, slipping back toward the galley. Michael exhaled. He sank into his seat as the departure board blinked green. Flight 447 boarding complete. The cabin lights brightened, resuming their routine glow. But for everyone who had watched, nothing would ever be the same. The virus of bias had been exposed, and the airline's highest halls of power were now on notice. Captain David Sinclair pushed through the galley doorway just as Michael Lee steadied himself in 1A. Sinclair's uniform was impeccably pressed, each silver stripe on his shoulders, catching the cabin lights like a beacon of authority. His eyes swept across the rows of passengers before coming to rest on the escalating scene in the first-class cabin. He didn't hesitate. He strode forward with measured steps, every eye snapping to his presence. "Excuse me," Sinclair said, voice low but commanding. "What's the delay, Lauren Tran?" The flight attendant who first challenged Michael stepped aside to let him assess the situation. Her jaw clenched as she leaned in to explain. "Sir is in the wrong seat, Captain," she said. "Our manifest shows an economy ticket." Without a word, Sinclair turned his attention to Michael. He extended a hand. "Sir, please present your boarding pass and identification." Michael didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, swiping to reveal his digital boarding pass. He set it gently on the tray table, then placed his physical ID and platinum status card beside it. The briefcase at his feet shifted as he leaned back into the cushion. Sinclair peered over the documents as though they might be counterfeit. Around them, passengers readied their phones, cameras poised for the next twist. The live stream count on Michael's screen had already climbed past 5,000. "This says seat 1A, first class," Michael said evenly. "Platinum status, 6 years running, 340,000 miles flown, paid 3 weeks ago." Sinclair's expression darkened. He shot a look at Lauren's tablet. "Ground security, please," he barked. In the aisle, 2 officers materialized as if summoned. Tom Sanders, a veteran whose posture still bore the pride of long service, and Emma Cho, new to the force but eager to follow her partner's lead. Their badges reflected the cabin's warm light. Sanders cleared his throat and approached Michael. "Sir, we need you to step off the aircraft," he said, voice courteous but firm. "We'll verify your ticket at the gate." Michael locked eyes with Sanders, sensing the officer's discomfort. "I've provided valid documents," he whispered. "Why am I being removed when I have every right to this seat?" Cho consulted her tablet. "Our system shows a coach ticket, sir," she insisted. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, the hum of the engines forming a backdrop to his calm resolve. "You're holding up departure over unverified assumptions," he said. "Check the timestamp on my boarding pass. It's real and it's correct." With every word, the cabin grew quieter, the tension pulsating through the air. A woman in row 3B gasped, hiding her phone behind a pillow, but not before the cameras had caught the movement. A businessman with a granite expression in 4A watched from behind his laptop, frowning as the live stream count ticked upward. Sanders lifted his hand to request patience, but Michael raised his own phone. "For the record, 2:49 p.m., flight 447. I'm in my paid first-class seat. I have valid ID and status. This is my documentation. I'm being denied my seat." His voice was steady, resonating through the cabin. Captain Sinclair cleared his throat. "We cannot delay departure any longer," he announced, glancing at the digital clock above the cabin door. "Please comply or we'll have to—" A sudden ping interrupted the captain's words. Michael's phone vibrated against the tray table. He swiped open the notification and held the screen aloft. Board meeting moved to conference room A8 p.m. Urgent. The cabin froze. Even the security officers exchanged puzzled glances. Sanders hesitated, his hand dropping to his side. Cho's eyes flicked between Michael and her tablet. "This is more than a seat dispute," Michael said, voice low enough that only the front rows could hear. "It's a summons to the highest levels of this airline." The hush deepened as passengers processed the gravity of that message. The air felt heavier, charged with the knowledge that someone somewhere had recognized the significance of what was unfolding. Lauren's face went pale. Sinclair's posture stiffened, the mask of piloting confidence cracking ever so slightly. "She's calling the ground supervisor," Sinclair muttered to Lauren. "Let's see what she says." Moments later, the cabin door hissed open again. Ground Supervisor Natalie Reyes entered, her tailored blazer crisp and her expression unreadable. She had been summoned from the terminal to address a routine delay. Now she found herself at the heart of an international incident. Natalie Sinclair began, voice tight. "We have a situation with a passenger in first class." Natalie scanned the cabin, her eyes landing on Michael. She held up her phone silently, notifying headquarters of her arrival, then approached the scene with purposeful strides. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice to a professional whisper, "I've just reviewed your file. Your seat is confirmed. I apologize for the confusion." A collective gasp rose from first class. Sanders and Cho froze mid-step, their paperwork forgotten. Even Lauren's tablet slid to the floor as she stared. Michael inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said. His gaze swept the cabin. It wasn't triumph, he felt, but a solemn vindication. Natalie leaned close to Sinclair. "That text I'm on," she whispered. "It's the CEO. They called an emergency board meeting the moment this went public." Sinclair's composed facade fell away entirely. He ran a hand through his hair. "You're serious?" Natalie nodded, glancing at the lit-up phones surrounding them. "This situation is now corporate level. We need to resume boarding immediately, but we have to address what happened." She turned back to the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. Please return to your seats. Boarding will continue shortly." The sting of injustice lingered even as the cabin slowly returned to its pre-flight rhythm. Phones clicked shut reluctantly. Cameras lingered to capture Natalie's words, but the immediate crisis seemed to deflate. Michael leaned back into his seat, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he had held. The board meeting alert still glowed faintly on his screen, a reminder that the real reckoning was yet to come. Around him, first-class passengers exchanged hushed remarks, some sympathetic, some still processing. Lauren approached with downcast eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, voice barely audible. "I should have checked your pass first." Michael offered a small nod. "Thank you." As Natalie gave the all-clear to the crew, the departure board flickered green Flight 447 boarding complete. The cabin lights brightened, the engine's hum ramped up, and the plane began its taxi toward the runway. But the ordinary hum of routine had been irreversibly altered. Cameras continued to record tweets, continued to spread, and Michael Lee, still buckled into 1A, stared out the window at the tarmac. He was not just a passenger anymore. He was the catalyst for a confrontation that would echo through the halls of power and shape the airline's future. And somewhere far above the engine's roar, corporate leaders were gathering to answer a summons they could no longer ignore. Michael Lee's phone glowed in his hand as he tapped the share button. The live stream window expanded to full screen, the viewer count racing past 8,000 in an instant. He cleared his throat softly, his voice calm enough to carry through the cabin without raising volume. "Ladies and gentlemen, 2:50 p.m. Flight 447. I have provided valid documentation. I have complied fully. If there is any further confusion, I need to speak with the ground supervisor immediately." He lowered his phone but kept the screen facing out, a silent request for the assembled passengers to bear witness. Murmurs rippled through the first-class cabin as phones flipped from selfie mode to record mode. The air seemed to crackle with anticipation. In that moment, he wasn't just a passenger. He was a catalyst, and every camera lens in the cabin was trained on him. Moments later, the now familiar hiss of the cabin door cut through the tension. Natalie Reyes stepped inside her tailored blazer, the only splash of color against the cabin's beige and tan palette. She held her phone to her ear as she approached her stride, purposeful. A knot of anxiety twisted at the back of her throat, but she didn't flinch under the weight of all those eyes. "Sir," she said softly as she reached Michael's row, her voice carrying a note of genuine apology. "I've reviewed your reservation. Seat 1A, first class. All of your details are correct. She glanced at his phone, then at the printed credentials on the tray. I sincerely apologize for the mistake. A hush fell over the cabin. Lincoln's baritone voice, momentarily silenced by surprise, regained its composure first. He managed a curt nod, but kept his eyes on Natalie as if searching for a hidden catch. The cabin staff exchanged uneasy glances. The security officers Tom Sanders and Emma Cho paused mid-step, confusion flickering in their expressions. Natalie turned her head slightly toward Captain Sinclair. That was when she let the other shoe drop in a stage whisper that carried to Sinclair's ear alone. "They've convened an emergency board meeting," she said. "The CEO has been briefed live. They want an immediate debrief." Sinclair's composed mask cracked, revealing a flicker of something darker, concern perhaps, or fear. He swallowed and straightened his shoulders, regaining a measure of command. He looked back at Michael, then at Natalie. "Very well," he said, voice low. "We'll proceed." Natalie offered Michael a respectful nod. "I'll ensure the crew receives updated guidance and will prioritize boarding." She gave the cabin one final sweep before stepping back toward the doorway. The entire first-class section exhaled in unison, a collective release of tension. Michael touched his phone to end the live stream, then tucked it away. He rebuckled his seatbelt with deliberate calm, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Around him, the cabin lights dimmed as the plane continued its taxi toward the runway. On the video screens embedded in the armrests, Flight 447's departure board blinked green, boarding complete. But Michael's mind was already far from the amber glow of the terminal lights. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the familiar hum of the engines reverberate through the cabin floor. This was the calm before the real storm, a storm that would reach all the way to the airline's highest echelons. Down in the terminal, conference room B awaited him. The elevator ride was swift, but Michael's thoughts churned with every passing floor. He replayed the cabin scene in his mind, the way Natalie's voice had betrayed a hint of panic, the way Captain Sinclair's eyes had shifted when he learned who was in that seat, the hush that fell as everyone realized this was no ordinary pre-flight mix-up. When the elevator doors slid open on the 47th floor, he stepped into a corridor lined with frosted glass doors. He brushed past a cluster of airline staff issuing final instructions, their faces awash in the blue light of tablet screens. A single nameplate caught his eye, Conference Room B, Board of Directors. He paused only long enough to straighten his tie and then entered. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The long oval table was surrounded by the airline's most powerful figures. Board members in crisp suits, legal counsel rifling through binders, PR executives muttering into headsets. At the head of the table sat Patricia Vance, the CEO herself. Her posture, rigid lips pressed in a determined line. Two large monitors behind her displayed split-screen feeds. One showed the live stream footage from the first-class cabin, the other displayed a rapidly dropping ticker tracking the airline's stock price. Patricia's sharp gaze snapped toward him as he entered. She did not rise, this was her domain after all, but her eyes narrowed in appraisal. The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes in that boardroom was on Michael Lee, the man who had turned a routine seat assignment into a crisis that now threatened to reshape Atlantic Airways. He walked to the head of the table, briefcase in hand, and placed it carefully on the polished wood surface. He met Patricia's gaze steadily, then turned to address the room. "Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice clear and unwavering. "Thank you for convening on such short notice. I understand you've seen the footage." Patricia's lip curled ever so slightly. "Yes, Mr. Lee," she said coolly. "Your actions have certainly expedited our understanding of the situation. Please explain what you require." He nodded once, then opened his briefcase. First, he said, reaching inside to withdraw a leather-bound folder embossed with the Chen Industries crest. "I need to understand why a simple verification process failed so spectacularly." Second, he continued as he slid the folder across the table toward Patricia. "I need a commitment to immediate corrective measures so that no passenger experiences this kind of treatment again." The legal counsel shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. Patricia raised a hand to silence him. "Understood, Mr. Lee," she said, "but the board will need specifics." Michael didn't hesitate. He extracted another document, a printed spreadsheet of internal customer complaints. Here he said, tapping the paper for emphasis. Atlantic Airways logged 147 discrimination-related complaints last year. That's 43% above the industry average. These weren't isolated incidents, they were patterns. Patterns you've deliberately ignored. Murmurs of discomfort rippled around the table. The CFO's pen froze mid-scribble. The PR director's eyes flew wide as she glanced at the live feed monitor. Patricia's jaw tightened. He pressed on. My demands are straightforward. Personnel involved in this incident must face immediate accountability. Comprehensive bias training must be deployed within 48 hours, and a third-party reporting system must be operational within 72 hours. If these conditions are not met, Chen Industries will consider divesting its 23% stake and advising our partners to do the same. The room's silence turned thick. Patricia looked down at the folder, then back at Michael, weighing her options with the cool detachment of a seasoned executive. Finally, she offered a curt nod. Conditions accepted, she said. A ripple of relief passed through Michael's shoulders, but he didn't relax just yet. Good, he replied. Let's draft the public statement now. Earth's not made for quiet water, Patricia. We might as well make some noise. And with that, the power play was complete. Michael Lee closed his briefcase, straightened his jacket, and stepped back. In the silence that followed, the conference room was left to digest the fact that a passenger in a white shirt and jeans had just rewritten the rules of Atlantic Airways, and perhaps of the entire airline industry. Outside, the real turbulence was underway, not in the skies, but in boardrooms, terminals, and newsrooms around the world. The quiet storm had arrived, and there was no calm on the horizon. The engine's steady drone was a familiar comfort, but this time it felt like the calm before a storm. Michael Lee watched Captain Sinclair and Ground Supervisor Natalie Reyes exchange hurried words just beyond the first-class curtain. Their heads were close together, voices hushed but urgent. He saw Natalie glance at her phone screen, eyes widening. Michael's own phone buzzed again, another text from an unknown number. He read, "Code red check. Conference room B now." He slipped his phone back into his pocket, then caught Natalie's eye. She nodded almost imperceptibly, acknowledging the message. A surge of anticipation rippled through Michael's veins. He straightened his jacket carefully, securing his briefcase across his lap. All eyes in that cabin remained fixed on him now, as if they recognized a shift in the atmosphere. Moments later, Captain Sinclair's voice crackled through the PA, though it sounded distant, swallowed by sudden weight. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We will be pausing boarding momentarily." His clipped tone left no room for questions. Michael rose, moving with deliberate calm down the narrow aisle. Passengers in first class craned their necks to follow him, curiosity replacing the initial outrage. The flight attendant who'd first challenged his seat stepped forward, her tablet still in hand, but she hesitated when Michael passed. Natalie rose too, providing a respectful clearance that even surprised Captain Sinclair. He watched Michael's back as he crossed the galley and stepped out of the cabin, disappearing into the jet bridge. Down below in the airline's corporate headquarters, Conference Room B resembled a high-stakes command center. The oval table glowed under overhead lights, but the real illumination came from 3 massive monitors lining the wall. One feed showed the live cabin footage, Michael's confident stride the sea of bewildered faces. Another ticker displayed Atlantic Airways' plummeting stock price. The third scrolled social media analytics, the hashtag Atlantic Air Discrimination, blazing red as it trended globally. Board members hovered around the table, their expressions a mixture of concern, indignation, and urgency. Legal counsel rifled through paperwork, PR executives whispered into earpieces, finance directors tapped calculators with white-knuckled intensity. Patricia Vance, the airline's chairperson, sat at the head of the table, her usually impeccable composure frayed at the edges. She glanced at her phone, confirming the emergency summons, then looked up at a cluster of empty chairs meant for her fellow executives. Her voice broke the tension. "Bring him in," she commanded. Within seconds, Natalie Reyes appeared in the doorway, motioning Michael into the room. The corporate titans turned as one, eyes focused on the man in a white shirt and jeans, a stark contrast to their tailored suits. Reporters and camera operators spilled into the room behind him, lenses clicking in rapid succession, broadcasting every second live to thousands watching around the world. Michael paused in the threshold, allowing the moment to settle. The hum of the engines felt miles away now. He lowered his briefcase onto the table with a soft thud and clicked it shut. All chatter ceased. Patricia rose slowly, studying him with a blend of admiration and trepidation. "Mr. Lee," she began, voice steady but tight. "I appreciate your cooperation in coming here. Please have a seat." Michael remained standing, letting his gaze sweep the room. "Thank you, Patricia." "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, using her first name deliberately enough to break formalities but respectful enough to command attention. "We have much to discuss, so let's proceed." A murmur of agreement rippled among the board members. The legal counsel shuffled closer, pen poised. The PR head leaned forward, eyes bright with anticipation. Patricia took her seat once more, tapping her pen against the table. Michael opened his briefcase again and withdrew a slim folder. He placed it squarely in front of Patricia. "This transcript," he said, "is your flight crew's own recording of the radio communications from 2:47 p.m. when I was first challenged. Time-stamped, unedited." He gave her a moment to absorb the weight of that statement, and this he continued, producing a second folder. "Is your internal customer service report. 147 discrimination complaints last year, 43% above industry average." Heads turned, eyebrows lifted. An audible gasp slipped from the CFO's lips. Patricia's pen stilled. Legal counsel swallowed. The room felt too small to contain the sudden tension. Michael let silence stretch until Patricia managed to speak. "These figures, I was not aware they were this high," she said, voice measured. "We have protocols in place." Michael nodded. "Intent isn't enough. Impact is what remains. My experience on Flight 447 was only the latest example. You have a choice: address these deep-seated issues today, or let them cost you far more tomorrow." Patricia's eyes flicked to her executive team, gesturing them to settle. Then she looked back at Michael. "Very well, let's hear your recommendations." He withdrew a third document, this one bearing the Chen Industries crest and stamped with bold letters, "Immediate Remediation Plan." He laid it on the table and began without hesitation. First, personnel accountability. The flight attendant, the officers, the supervisors involved must face disciplinary action. Second, mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff within 48 hours. Third, implement a third-party reporting system within 72 hours, no internal filtering. He paused, letting the room absorb each demand. Fourth, he continued public transparency. Publish discrimination metrics quarterly available to all stakeholders. Fifth, a $500,000 fund dedicated to community partnerships and support for affected passengers. Patricia blinked twice, then looked at her counsel. Legal nodded slowly. Finance shifted in his seat. It was clear these measures carried weight and cost, but the room had no viable objections. Michael closed the folder. If these steps are not implemented on this timeline, Chen Industries will consider divesting its 23% stake and advising our partners to follow suit. The silence that followed was charged. Patricia exhaled a decisive sound. "Conditions accepted?" She said, her voice steady. "We will draft the announcement immediately." Michael offered a small nod, then cracked a faint smile. "Good. Let's draft it together." He extended a pen across the table. Cameras captured the handshake. Reporters scribbled notes. The monitors behind them flickered from crisis metrics to the words, "Atlantic Airways committing to dignity in the skies." As Michael stepped back into the corridor, the elevator doors closing behind him, he felt the familiar hum of the engines through the metal walls. But he also felt something new, a current of change running through the airline, from the cabin to the boardroom, from the startled passengers to the corporate titans. The engines sang, the stock tickers shifted upward, and somewhere in the cabin, Captain Sinclair made a quiet announcement to resume taxiing. The runway lights blurred as the plane prepared to depart. Michael settled back into his first-class seat, closing his eyes for a moment. The seat's soft leather cradled him, but his mind was already on the next phase, ensuring that the promises made in Conference Room B would become reality in every cabin, every terminal, every flight. Outside the window, the tarmac stretched into the distance. Inside, Atlantic Airways' world had irrevocably changed, and the real journey toward respect and accountability was only just beginning. Michael Lee took a steadying breath as the elevator doors slid shut behind him. He found himself once again face to face with Atlantic Airways' most powerful figures, but this time the balance of power had shifted. The boardroom was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the monitors displaying the live feed from Gate 23. He stepped forward, his footsteps deliberate against the polished hardwood floor. At the head of the mahogany table sat Patricia Vance. Her posture, once straight-backed and confident, now bore the weight of the morning's chaos. Around her, the company's legal counsel, finance directors, human resources chiefs, and PR executives waited with taut expressions. Every eye in the room was on Michael, a man in a white shirt and jeans who had just walked off a mid-flight confrontation and straight into the boardroom. When he paused at the table's edge, the room held its collective breath. Without a word, Michael placed his leather briefcase on the table. The click of its clasp echoed in the hush. He opened it with precise care and withdrew two thick folders bound in navy blue. One bore the title Crew Communication Transcript Flight 447-247 p.m. The other, Internal Customer Service Report 2024. He laid them down with a decisive thud that resonated through the room. All eyes fixed on the first folder as Michael flipped it open to the front page, revealing time-stamped radio communications between the flight crew and ground control. The numbers jumped out immediately, seconds marking every instruction, every misstep. A hush rippled through the board members as they recognized the gravity of what they were about to read. Michael looked up at his gaze, meeting Patricia's. "This transcript is unedited," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It shows how quickly assumptions replaced procedure when I simply sat in my paid first-class seat." He slid the second folder across the table, pushing it toward Patricia. "And this report," he continued, "details every discrimination complaint filed against Atlantic Airways in the last calendar year. 147. That's 43% above the industry average." Patricia's jaw tightened, her fingers curled around the edge of the folder. She glanced at the legal counsel, who nodded imperceptibly. The CFO's pen hovered above his notepad, ready to capture every word. Michael allowed the weight of those statistics to settle before continuing. "I have 3 demands," Michael said. He waited until all heads rose from documents and notebooks. "First, the immediate termination of every individual whose actions directly contributed to the humiliation and discrimination I experienced. That includes the flight attendant, the security officers, and the supervisors who refused to verify my credentials." He paused to let the enormity of that directive sink in. "Second, a mandatory bias training program rolled out to all customer-facing employees within 48 hours. No exceptions." He let his look sweep the room, the HR vice president, the training managers, the floor supervisors. "When people fly with this airline," he resumed, "they shouldn't fear stereotyping or unfair treatment based on appearance." His tone was measured but steely. "Third, the implementation of an independent third-party reporting system within 72 hours. This system must allow passengers and employees to report incidents without fear of reprisal or cover-up." He leaned forward, voice lowering slightly. "If these conditions are not met, Chen Industries will divest its entire 23% stake in Atlantic Airways and advise our partners to do the same." Silence stretched. The only sound was the soft click of the monitors cycling through social media mentions and stock ticker updates. Atlantic Airways' share price was already dipping. Patricia closed her folder with a slow, deliberate motion. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Lee, you have laid out extraordinary demands, and I appreciate your clarity." She paused, drawing a breath. "We accept all conditions." A murmur ran around the room as executives exchanged glances. The legal counsel pulled a pen from her pocket. The PR chief straightened, anticipating crisis statements. The finance director began recalculating projections. Michael allowed himself a faint nod. Patricia continued, her voice steady. "We will draft the public announcement immediately outlining our commitment to dignity, accountability, and transparency. I will personally oversee the timeline to ensure every step is executed." She looked directly at Michael. "Thank you for holding us accountable." Michael returned her gaze. "Thank you for listening." He turned slightly to face the cameras now streaming live from a dozen angles around the room. And to everyone watching, he added, his voice warm but resolute. "This is only the beginning. We will measure our progress in days, weeks, and months, not just in promises, but in tangible change." Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled furiously. The sound of pens on notepads joined the faint hum of approval from board members. Michael closed his briefcase with a final click. Before he left, Patricia rose and offered her hand. He stood meeting her handshake firmly. As their hands closed, the room seemed to exhale. The message was clear. A new era had begun for Atlantic Airways. Stepping back into the elevator, Michael felt the adrenaline drain from his limbs, replaced by a quiet determination. Down in the terminal, Gate 23 awaited the resumption of boarding. He was about to reclaim his seat on Flight 447, but the reverberations of this power play would carry far beyond a single flight. As the elevator doors slid shut, Michael glanced at his watch. The clock read 3:15 p.m., 28 minutes since he first sat in 1A. In less than half an hour, he had forced a global airline to confront its failures in real time and accept a blueprint for accountability. He allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. In that brief moment of reflection, Michael thought of every passenger who had ever faced discrimination, every employee pressured to stay silent, every incident buried in a corporate backroom. Now each of those moments would have a voice. Every flight crew would know their actions were under scrutiny. Future passengers could fly with the assurance that their dignity mattered. The elevator arrived at the gate level. Michael stepped out into a transformed scene, reporters clustered around boarding gates. Ground staff wore new briefing badges, and a sense of purpose pervaded the air. He walked toward the jet bridge, the mahogany table, and corporate titans already feeling like a distant arena. Sliding back into his seat in first class, Michael buckled in once more. He glanced at the folded copy of the remediation plan tucked beneath his armrest. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight attendant began the final pre-flight safety demonstration. But Michael knew the real demonstration had already played out in boardrooms, on social media, across every screen tuned to #Atlantic Air Discrimination. As the engines rumbled and Flight 447 taxied toward the runway, Michael closed his eyes and leaned back. The sky outside stretched infinite and free, a promise of possibility. Today he had reshaped the rules. Tomorrow, those changes would take flight. The afternoon sun filtered through the terminal's expansive windows, casting a stark brightness over Gate 23. What had once been a nondescript boarding area now felt electric, as though the space itself had awakened to witness something unprecedented. Michael Lee stood at the center of the crowd, his white shirt and jeans still bearing the faint signs of his mid-flight boardroom inversion. Ground Supervisor Janet Williams approached him, folder in hand, her posture transformed. Gone was the rigid officer who had once pointed him toward Coach. Now she moved with purpose and humility. She held up a freshly printed duty roster. Mr. Lee, as per your directives, Captain Rodriguez and Ms. Mitchell will begin bias sensitivity retraining immediately. You'll notice their names here. She tapped the list, her voice steady but earnest. Michael nodded, then turned to address the assembled passengers. Nearly 100 souls who had lingered behind phones at the ready footage still streaming across multiple platforms. He saw familiar faces: the elderly woman whose clip had gone viral, the teenage girl who had streamed on TikTok, the businessman who had muttered, "This can't be real." They watched him now with a mix of anticipation and relief. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael began voice carrying across the terminal's hum. Today we witnessed what happens when assumptions override procedure, when dignity is cast aside in favor of misjudgment. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. That ends now. He glanced at Janet, then swept his gaze back over the crowd. Tonight, every crew member scheduled for Flight 447 will attend a mandatory briefing on respect and verification. No exceptions. They will learn that verifying a passenger's credentials isn't optional, it's essential to your dignity and safety. Heads nodded, murmurs of approval rising. Michael removed a stack of apology letters from his briefcase, one for each passenger present. He handed the first to the elderly woman, then the teenage girl, then the businessman in the back. Each of you will receive a formal apology from Atlantic Airways. Additionally, you'll be offered a complimentary upgrade on your next flight because respect should never be delayed. He paused, offering a sincere smile. Because dignity cannot wait. A ripple of spontaneous applause kindled in the terminal. It started quietly. One set of hands clapping, then grew as more passengers joined in. Journalists stepped forward, capturing both video and stills. The screens above the counters switched to a single scrolling message: Atlantic Airways commits to dignity in the skies. Janet's eyes glistened as she watched the crowd's reaction. She had spent her entire career ensuring flights left on time. Today, her role had expanded to safeguarding passengers' honor. She swallowed and turned to Michael. "Thank you for holding us accountable." Michael offered a small nod. "Thank you for acting swiftly. This is more than a gesture, it's a promise." Behind them, the boarding desks reactivated. Ground staff pinned new signage above each counter. "Please verify your boarding pass and ID, no assumptions." A pilot in uniform peered out at the scene, his stance respectful. Flight attendants gathered in clusters, discussing the evening's retraining. Even in their hurried preparations, their chatter bore a new resolve that no passenger would ever again be doubted for the color of their skin or the casualness of their attire. As the first of the apology letters circulated among the passengers, Janet's radio crackled. "All briefing rooms are set up. Staff will begin sessions at 6 p.m. She glanced at Michael, relief and determination mingling on her face. Michael turned back to the terminal. "Boarding for Flight 447 will resume in 20 minutes. Please proceed to Gate 23 with your boarding passes ready." His tone was calm, yet carried the same insistence that had guided him through boardrooms and cabin aisles alike. Phones continued to record, but the mood had shifted from outrage to hope. Passengers exchanged smiles as though relieved that today's trials would lead to tomorrow's standards. The passenger who once chickened out of confrontation now returned his smile with gratitude. The teenage streamer gave a thumbs up, and the elderly woman patted Michael gently on the shoulder before making her way to the gate. South of the boarding bridge, mechanics prepared the jet's engines for departure. Crews gathered around monitors displaying the updated training timeline. Respect briefings tonight at 6. System verification protocols deployed immediately. A quiet pride had replaced the earlier tension. Michael watched this transformation unfold, then turned and walked toward the jet bridge himself. As he stepped onto the gangway, he looked back one last time at Gate 23. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, the terminal hummed, not with routine logistics, but with a renewed commitment to human dignity, an ethos born from conflict sealed with accountability. Once inside the cabin, Michael settled back into his familiar 1A seat. The engine's roar vibrated beneath him as the aircraft taxied toward the runway. Yet he felt grounded by something deeper, the knowledge that his insistence on fairness had sparked a sea change. Atlantic Airways would never again regard a passenger as just another face in the crowd. As Flight 447 lifted into the sky, the terminal lights fading behind him, Michael Lee closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of reflection. Today's reckoning in the terminal had proven that even under fluorescent glare, real change could take hold. One reminder at a time that dignity once lost could be reclaimed, and once reclaimed must never be relinquished. Michael stepped off the elevator into the executive suite, the doors closing behind him with a decisive click. The air inside the glass-walled room felt cooler, tighter, an atmosphere of expectation rather than accusation. Less than 2 hours had passed since he'd rallied Gate 23 into a makeshift amphitheater of accountability. Now he found himself at the helm of a different stage, the heart of Atlantic Airways leadership. The usual hush of morning briefings and quarterly forecasts had been replaced by something more urgent, more alive. A large screen on the far wall displayed a live dashboard of key metrics. Discrimination complaints nationwide were down by 67% since that afternoon's uproar at Gate 23. Customer satisfaction ratings had climbed 12 points. 84% of frontline staff had completed bias sensitivity and verification training. In a corner, a ticker scrolled through real-time updates. New reporting hotline active. First incident logged. Training modules live in 48 hours. Anonymous ombudsman system to launch in 72 hours. The data pulsed in vivid color, as clear and unignorable as any financial graph. Patricia Vance, Atlantic's chair and CEO, sat at the polished mahogany table, her posture rigid but her eyes bright with determination. To her left was CFO Derek Lowe, tapping a pen against a notepad, and to her right sat Chief Legal Counsel Amanda Reyes, reviewing the printed terms of their new Dignity in the Skies charter. Human Resources Vice President Carmen Alvarez nodded as she absorbed the figures, while the head of operations Mark Eldridge leaned forward, absorbing every word. A handful of other executives filled the seats around the table, each carrying the weight of their respective portfolios. Michael placed a leather-bound folder in front of Patricia and gently opened it. "Thank you all for convening so quickly," He began voice calm but charged. We've made monumental progress, but the real work lies ahead. Today I want to outline the final pillars that will ensure these gains aren't temporary, so that Atlantic Airways leads the industry in respect, not just in profit. He retrieved a stack of meticulously prepared documents and laid the first set before Derek. First, absolute transparency. We publish our bias report dashboard publicly updated monthly. No more hidden numbers, no more buried complaints. Let our passengers, our partners, and our regulators see exactly where we stand. Derek glanced at the screen, recalibrated, then met Michael's gaze. Public data every 30 days, he said, his voice measured. We'll post it on our website, include an executive summary for clarity, and send alerts when new milestones are hit. Michael nodded and turned to Carmen. Second, accountability built into our management structure. Every manager's performance review must include diversity and respect metrics. Miss your targets, miss your bonus. If respect is policy, rewards must follow that policy. Carmen's fingers tightened around her pen. We can integrate these metrics into existing KPIs. We'll need to adjust compensation grids, but this is absolutely doable. It will hold each leader personally responsible. Michael allowed a small smile. Good. Third, amplify passenger voices. We invite genuine customer advocates, passengers who have experienced bias, to participate in our training sessions. Let them tell their stories face-to-face with our crews so that empathy, not assumption, guides every interaction. Amanda cleared her throat. Legally, we need to ensure participants are protected and compensated appropriately. But yes, having real voices in the training room will humanize these scenarios beyond any script. Michael turned toward the door where a discreet assistant held a tablet. He tapped it, and a final document slid across the table, an agreement outlining a permanent endowment fund managed by the Chen Foundation. Fourth, partnership for lasting impact. Chen Foundation will dedicate a six-figure annual endowment to support ongoing audit scholarships for underrepresented aviation students and a rapid response legal fund for discrimination incidents. We're not just fixing a problem, we're cultivating future change makers. Mark Eldridge looked up, brow raised. An endowment at this scale will require detailed oversight, but the brand goodwill and genuine social impact will far outweigh the costs. Michael leaned back, surveying the room. These four pillars, transparency, accountability, empathy, and investment, form the backbone of our new charter. Together they ensure that what happened at Gate 23 becomes a turning point, not a footnote. Patricia closed her folder, then looked at each executive in turn. I move that we adopt these pillars immediately, with implementation timelines, transparency, dashboard live by month's end, compensation integration, by next quarter, passenger advocate program launching within 90 days, and the endowment fund operational by year-end. She paused, letting the weight of her commitment sink in. All in favor? As one, the group voiced their agreement. Pens scratched across paper as signatures were appended to the charter's final page. The click of metal on paper echoed faintly through the suite. Michael allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The agreements, once mere words on a page, now stood as promises backed by data policy and resources. When he stepped out of the suite, the corporate horizon had indeed shifted. Atlantic Airways was no longer just an airline. It was an institution pledging perpetual respect. Outside the glass walls, the city moved on traffic, streaming beneath overpasses, commuters walking to subway stations, the tide of urban life ebbing and flowing. But inside those walls, Atlantic had charted a new course. The flights departing the next day would carry more than passengers to distant cities. They would carry the promise of dignity, clarity, and accountability woven into every takeoff and landing. Michael straightened his suit jacket and allowed himself a final glance at the live metrics on the screen. The numbers were no longer abstract. They were proof that real change can happen when leadership meets resolve. He stepped into the hallway, closing the glass doors gently behind him. Tomorrow's flights awaited, and for the first time in memory, the flight path ahead felt guided by something far greater than profit margins. It was guided by principle and by the unshakable truth that every passenger deserves to belong. The sun had barely risen when Atlantic Airways' story broke across every major outlet. In New York, the Financial Times banner headline read, "Airline reinvents itself after viral scandal." In London, The Guardian proclaimed one passenger upended an $8 billion enterprise in 48 hours. Tokyo's Nikkei ran an editorial analyzing the financial implications, while Sydney's The Age spotlighted the human element, how a white shirt and a boarding pass sparked global change. By mid-morning, the U.S. House Committee on Transportation had convened an emergency hearing. Representatives packed the chamber in Washington, D.C., their seats filled with aides and press. Cameras transmitted live feeds to millions of viewers. At the witness table sat Patricia Vance, Atlantic Airways CEO, flanked by executives whose faces still bore traces of sleepless nights. Committee Chair Sheila Murphy leaned forward, gavel in hand, and fixed Patricia with a steely gaze. "Ms. Vance, can Atlantic Airways guarantee that the Dignity in the Skies charter will be adopted industry-wide?" Patricia straightened in her seat. "Yes, Chair Murphy. We have already begun discussions with 4 other carriers. We intend to lead by example, not merely comply with regulation." Across the ocean in Frankfurt, Lufthansa's boardroom broke into discussion as executives watched the live stream. Their CEO tapped his pen against the table and said, "We cannot afford to be left behind. Today we launch our own bias audit system." Within hours, Lufthansa's HR and operations teams were drafting parallel initiatives mirroring Atlantic's transparency dashboard and mandatory training timelines. In Sydney, a television debate among regulators and aviation experts cited the Chen effect as a global catalyst. The panel consensus: if an $8 billion airline could transform itself overnight, no carrier would risk falling short. By afternoon, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission announced a review of industry-wide bias reporting standards. Meanwhile, in Chicago's gleaming offices of the Department of Transportation Secretary Michael Rodriguez, no relation to Captain Rodriguez, sat down with Michael Chen. They pored over draft guidelines for national policy, quarterly public reporting of discrimination complaints, independent ombudsman in every major hub, and a federal grant program for diversity scholarships across aviation schools. The guidelines, later nicknamed the Atlantic Airways Rules, carried the weight of bipartisan support. As evening fell, the grand ballroom at the Transportation Equality Summit filled to capacity. Airlines, bus companies, rail operators, and rideshare executives jostled for seats. Activists and civil rights leaders took their places alongside government officials and lawyers. A gigantic screen behind the stage cycled through tweets tagged #Dignity. In-transit stories of passengers denied, service voices of advocates urging accountability, and applause emojis flooding in from thousands of corners. When Michael Chen stepped to the podium, the room erupted in applause. He paused until the clapping subsided, then swept his gaze over the audience. He spoke without notes, his voice calm but resonant. "Today we proved that justice isn't an afterthought. It must be policy. Dignity isn't a privilege bestowed, it is a right owed to every traveler. When we share our stories, we ignite the power to transform entire industries." He clicked a remote, and behind him a graph appeared. Airline discrimination complaints plummeting 71% industry-wide since late 2025. The curve was dramatic, once a stubborn plateau, now a sharp decline. Next to it, consumer satisfaction scores climbed in parallel. A hush fell as he continued. "We didn't erase bias overnight. We built systems to prevent it. We tied executive pay to respect metrics. We empowered passengers as watchdogs. And we invested in future leaders from underrepresented communities. That is stakeholder activism in real time." From the back of the room, a hand rose. It belonged to Sarah Mitchell, the former flight attendant at the center of the scandal. Now a diversity consultant, she stood and addressed Michael directly. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she said, voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I was the one who refused to check Mr. Chen's valid documents. I let my assumptions guide me. I want to apologize publicly and personally, and to thank you. Your leadership changed my life. You taught me that accountability can turn perpetrators into advocates." The crowd rose to its feet in a standing ovation. Michael nodded appreciatively and replied, "Sarah, your courage to learn and to lead by example is exactly what this movement needs. Thank you." In the days that followed, the ripple became a wave. Greyhound announced a bias training program for all bus operators. Amtrak elevated its chief diversity officer role. 3 major hotel chains unveiled anonymous reporting systems, while rideshare companies pledged transparent resolution metrics. Even beyond transportation, corporate boards in finance, retail, and healthcare cited the Chen Protocol in their diversity audits. Business schools scrambled to incorporate the Atlantic case into curricula. Back home in Chicago, Michael returned to his office overlooking Lake Michigan. His inbox overflowed with letters from passengers sharing their own stories of discrimination. One from Angela Thompson, a young MBA grad, read, "Thank you for showing me that change is possible. I'm now working with the ACLU to document bias in airline treatment." Michael leaned back in his chair and smiled. A single boarding pass dispute had become a global movement, proving that individual action documented, shared, leveraged could rewrite entrenched systems. As the final plenary at the summit concluded, hashtags still trended, regulations moved forward, and cultural norms shifted. What began at 30,000 feet on Flight 447 had soared into a mandate for change worldwide. And as night fell over the city, the promise carried on every journey that every passenger in every seat truly belongs. 2 years after that fateful day on Flight 447, the world of travel had been irrevocably transformed. In gleaming corporate offices from New York to Tokyo, executive teams no longer discussed quarterly profits without also reviewing respect metrics side by side. Diversity and inclusion leaders, once relegated to backrooms, now sat at the table for every strategic planning session. Annual reports published by major airlines included charts tracking incidents of bias resolution times and passenger satisfaction scores in equal measure with revenue and on-time performance. Transparency was no longer a buzzword, it was the currency of trust. In Washington, regulators had codified dignity and transit standards into federal law. Every airline operating in U.S. airspace was required to report discrimination complaints publicly, each quarter audited by independent third parties. Similar policies began to spring up around the globe. In Europe, the European Aviation Safety Agency mandated bias awareness training for all cabin crew. In Australia, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority established anonymous hotlines for passengers to report mistreatment, with each complaint tracked and resolved within days, not weeks. Airports themselves joined the movement. Signage throughout terminals reminded travelers that their voices mattered, and digital kiosks offered real-time feedback channels. On the tarmac at O'Hare Ground, staff no longer rushed through pre-boarding without a second thought. They now attended regular respect rehearsals, role-playing scenarios, so that every greeting, whether to a familiar frequent flyer or a first-time traveler, was delivered with warmth and attention. Flight attendants flipped through cabin briefings that included passenger demographics and notes from the anonymous reporting system. No longer a chore, these preparations became a source of pride. Colleagues measured themselves not by how quickly they boarded passengers, but by how many sincere smiles they collected. Passengers, too, had evolved. Smartphones were never absent from one another's hands, but now those devices were wielded explicitly as tools of accountability. A quick photo of a boarding pass, a brief recording of a disembodied move to coach, these gestures carried weight. Travelers shared their experiences on social media with the hashtag #DignityInTransit, confident that their stories would spark swift corporate responses rather than fade into bureaucratic limbo. Travel bloggers and vloggers, once focused on seat reviews and amenity upgrades, now highlighted human stories. An elderly passenger guided gently to their seat, a non-native speaker comforted by a bilingual attendant, a wheelchair user whose pre-boarding procedure was seamless and dignified. Industry-wide data reflected the shift. Within 18 months of the Flight 447 incident, discrimination complaints across major U.S. carriers had plummeted by 71%. International filings dropped in tandem, validating the power of systemic intervention. Share prices, which initially dipped in the crisis's wake, had rebounded and climbed higher than before, fueled by consumer trust and a reputation for genuine reform. Investor presentations proudly touted the company's commitment to social responsibility as a core differentiator, no longer an afterthought, but a value proposition. At the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Michael Chen took the stage for the Transportation Equality Summit's keynote address. He was introduced not only as the CEO of Chen Industries, but as the catalyst for an industry-wide reckoning. The auditorium brimmed with airline executives, government officials, civil rights activists, and everyday travelers, each representing a piece of the ecosystem he had helped reshape. As Michael began to speak, the room fell silent, every ear attuned to the man who had once been asked to leave his seat. He opened with a simple truth. Systemic change is neither easy nor comfortable, but it is absolutely essential. He described those first harrowing minutes when his badge and boarding pass were dismissed as irrelevant, when the only proof that mattered was the relentless real-time documentation of his truth. It wasn't anger or outrage that moved the dial, he told the crowd. It was the power of evidence, the clarity of leverage, and the discipline of systematic thinking. Behind him, a series of imagery displayed on the giant screens, a timeline tracing key milestones from the Instagram clip that ignited an emergency board meeting to the global adoption of standardized bias report dashboards. He pointed out that each milestone had been driven by ordinary people refusing to accept indignity. Every passenger who recorded those first moments at Gate 23 became a stakeholder in progress, he said. Every tweet, every live stream, every social media post forced corporate leaders to choose transparency or chaos. Michael paused and let that sink in. He then shifted to the broader impact. Today we see these practices not only in aviation, but in bus lines, train systems, even rideshare services. We've funded legal clinics for those without the means to challenge injustice. We've sponsored scholarships for underrepresented aviation students. And we've created an endowment through the Chen Foundation to support ongoing audits and rapid response teams. His vision had become an evolving playbook for any institution seeking to embed dignity at its core. A hand rose in the audience. It belonged to Sarah Mitchell, the former flight attendant whose bias had set this chain of events in motion. She spoke of her journey from error to advocacy. I learned that humility and accountability can transform not just individuals, but entire organizations. The crowd responded with applause that thundered through the hall. Michael invited Sarah to join him on stage, and together they issued a challenge. Let every sector ask itself this question. How can we ensure that every individual we serve feels valued and respected? As the summit concluded, the live-stream chat overflowed with reactions from around the world. Comments ranged from, "Finally, a blueprint for real change," to, "This is just the beginning." The hashtag #dignity in transit trended across platforms in multiple countries. And in an unexpected but fitting moment, an email popped up on Michael's phone, an invitation to advise the International Civil Aviation Organization on global standards for non-discrimination training. 2 years after Flight 447, the landscape of travel had been rewoven. Policies that once felt burdensome were now embraced as hallmarks of quality. Leaders spoke of respect ROI alongside financial metrics. Researchers studied the so-called Chen Protocol in business school case studies. Civil rights lawyers cited the Atlantic outcome in courtrooms seeking reforms beyond transportation, extending into housing, healthcare, and education. Yet for Michael, the most profound victory was personal. On his own next Atlantic flight back to Chicago, an eager young flight attendant greeted him by name when he mentioned his preference for water and a window seat. She not only obliged, but shared a shy smile that said, "We know you belong." He looked around the cabin and saw faces of every color, every background, each treated with equal professionalism and warmth. In that moment, he knew that systemic change had taken root. The next passenger who looked like him or anyone else would never have to fight for basic respect again. As Michael Chen's car glided through downtown Chicago that evening, he reflected on a simple truth: change happens when ordinary moments become collective movements. It begins when one person refuses to accept injustice and invites the world to bear witness. From a modest white shirt in a first-class cabin to the global stage of policy reform, the journey had proven that dignity is universal and worth every effort to protect. And so as tomorrow's flights prepared to take off into a sky still vast with possibility, one truth endured in every cabin, every terminal, and every boardroom: every passenger truly belongs.